the acting director, who was Obama's former head of his security detail, came in and is shaking things up, which is exactly what they wanted to do. It's the first big shakeup since the Secret Service director resigned last year in October. Four leaders who were deputy leaders in the agency who covered very important areas. They oversaw protection, investigations, technology, and public affairs, have been asked either to step down, resign, or take positions elsewhere in the Secret Service or within the Department of Homeland Security.
Ruth Marcus, your paper, The Washington Post, has been way out ahead on this Secret Service story. Does this satisfy critics that things are being done that will fix that agency?
Well, Washington's first instinct when it deals with a problem is to fire people. And given the scathing report that was produced by the analysis of the Secret Service, and given what's on the front page of my newspaper and others, that seems like an appropriate response here. The question that this shakeup doesn't quite answer is what next and how to help remake the culture of that agency, which does seem to have been really problematic.
Ruth Marcus, she's a columnist at The Washington Post. We're also joined this hour by Perry Bacon. He's senior political reporter at NBC News, and by Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what Congress managed to do this week. Stay with us.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Lumosity.com, brain training designed by neuroscientists that has been used by 60 million people worldwide, with personalized training programs to challenge memory, attention, and problem solving. Learn more at Lumosity.com. From Vicki and Roger Sant and Island Press, which offers solutions to environmental problems in print, in person, and online at islandpress.org. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
Welcome back. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. You're listening to our Friday News Roundup. You can watch us as well. Video of this hour of the Friday News Roundup is streaming live on drshow.org. And we're going to take your calls. Our phone lines are now open. 1-800-433-8850 is our toll-free number. Well, Perry, Republicans have gotten finally the unified control of Congress they want. We know they hate the president's action on immigration, but they seem to be having some divisions on what to do about it. What happened this week?
So this week they tried to repeal two different things. They passed a provision that would reverse the executive action the president took in November that was called the Deferred Action Program, that essentially legalized a lot of the children of U.S. citizens, children of people who came here, the parents of the sort of undocumented people who are here. Often their children are citizens, but they are not citizens. So the Republicans tried to reverse that this week. So they passed the bill in the House to do that. They also passed another provision that would reverse the DACA of 2012 that basically legalized lots of children here and younger people who are here in the country as well. So that one was more divisive. A lot of Republicans in the House were wary of getting rid of the protection for children versus the one for adults they were pretty much unified on. Key question now is what happens in the Senate. The Senate Republicans are a little more nervous about the notion that they are being perceived as kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Latino community. So that's the tension now: is where does this happen? Where does this move that the House took take the Senate, and ultimately what does the president do here, because the president is very unlikely to sign a bill to reverse two of his major executive actions. But DHS funding is due to expire in February, and that's the big tension here.
So the people, Ruth, the Republicans most opposed to immigration would say, hey, let's put funding for the Department of Homeland Security at risk to make our point. But the Republican leadership does not seem to be there.
Absolutely. We know how this book is going to end. We don't know how many chapters it's going to take to get it to end, because it's very clear that the Republican leadership in both the House and the Senate, in fact, and I'm going to just say this in a slightly provocative way, and most sane Republicans, and I mean politically sane Republicans, understand that defunding the Department of Homeland Security, particularly after what's happened in Europe and what's happening in Europe, is not a good idea for the party. So we know the Department of Homeland Security isn't going to shut down. We also know that there are not the votes in the Senate, and that even if there were, the president would not sign a repeal either of his executive order, the most recent one, or of the Deferred Action for Children program, the Dreamers program. And so this is a kind of a temper tantrum, as I see it, on the part of the House Republicans, the more extreme ones, to have their voices heard, to express their opposition, the majority of them, to both of those programs. And they know in the end that they are going to have to accede to a more restrained bill that contains neither of those things, that is going to come back from the Senate, or in the unlikely event you could get 60 votes in the Senate, which Mitch McConnell understands he's not going to get, comes back from a presidential veto. In the end, Homeland Security is going to be funded. These immigration provisions are going to be stripped. They're going to have to express their unhappiness with the president somehow else.
The Republicans have 54 votes in the Senate. As Ruth just said, they would need 60 to make this happen. It's not going to happen. Democrats, I mean, there are some Democrats who may not have been super excited about how the executive action came through and how Obama is achieving his goals on immigration, but they want immigration reform. And even though the White House this week wouldn't say if the president's going to mention immigration in his State of the Union address, he almost surely will, and he will use the same message that he used in November. If you don't like it, pass a bill. And he's definitely not going to sign this one if it came to his desk.
Well, Perry, given that everybody knows that this isn't going to become law, what's the political impact of Republicans going ahead and voting to reverse these immigration actions?
I think, like Ruth alluded to, it satisfies their base. Their base is very, if you go, listen to Rush Limbaugh, the talk radio crowd is very angry about this executive action. So it goes to satisfy their base, first of all. And they ultimately know they can, and when Obama vetoes it, as they know he will, then they can sort of attack him and criticize him. As one thing the Republicans have all agreed upon that makes it easy to say is the president is the president of overreach. He's the imperial president. This will fit in their messages a lot. But if you're one of the Republicans who is in San Diego right now, the RNC's meeting there, I think you may be a little more nervous about this. One thing there's a lot of discussion about is how do the Republicans win more of the minority vote in 2016? Jeb Bush is kind of already talking about that. I suspect he's not a huge fan of what we're seeing right now.
And I think just to follow on what Perry was saying, one of the most interesting things that happened this week was the closeness of the House vote to repeal the Deferred Action for Children program, the Dreamers program, the lesser controversial of the two Obama unilateral actions. 26 Republicans, and if you look at, they're from border states, they're from what counts as more swing districts, places with a lot of Hispanic voters, voted in favor of the president's program. In other words, voted not to repeal it. It passed by the slimmest of majorities, and that, I think, is telling about where the Republican Party understands it needs to head going forward.
Perry mentioned what the Republicans can do about this, and they can highlight this in their own campaigns. But the flip side of that is the Democrats will also be able to hold up this vote and say to Latinos, look, Not only have the Republicans not been supportive of an overall bill on immigration reform, they have voted against these at least one very popular measure regarding children. And I can guarantee you, to the extent that a reporter can guarantee anything, that you will hear presidential candidates on the Democratic side bringing up that vote.
So, immigration is an issue we cover. We think we understand it pretty well. The House also passed legislation this week quite easily, 271-54, on banking regulations that are enormously complicated and harder to cover, easing some of the Dodd-Frank rules. This is something that is of enormous importance, I think, Perry, to those who worry about the practices that got us into the huge financial problems that started in 2008.
Susan, like you said, these laws are extremely complicated. I'm going to read to you what the House did this week because I think I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on banking. Part of the law requires banks to divest their holdings of collateralized loan obligations, types of financial securities primarily backed by commercial loans. The Federal Reserve had delayed that requirement until 2017. This House law would delay it further till 2019. So let me broaden this out. What I would say is this provision itself, I don't think is hugely important to the law, Dodd-Frank overall. But I think you're seeing is the Republicans and I would say the Wall Street banks have an intentional strategy of trying to wind back Dodd-Frank by adding in provisions in every a death by 1,000 cuts. Same thing they've done with Obamacare, which try to propose small. They try to propose a big repeal, but also little small repeals all the time. And the banks have thought about this a lot. We're not going to attack Dodd-Frank at once. The president's going to veto that. What we can do is get even some Democrats to vote for little changes to the bill that will eventually unwind some of its more important parts. And that's what you're seeing is this Dodd-Frank fight is going to be a big part of this next 2 years in Congress, and it'll be a big part while people will keep talking about Elizabeth Warren for president as well, because she's going to be the leading fighter of it.
Well, right, because now it goes from the House to the Senate. Elizabeth Warren has got to be a voice against this, right?
Absolutely. This is a 2-year delay in implementation of what's known as the Volcker Rule, and the basic concept of it, and I'm not going to talk about collateralized loan obligations, but the basic concept of it is to make sure that banks do not keep these really risky ventures on their books, potentially exploding them and exposing the taxpayer to risk. And this is another one of the several veto threats that has emanated from the White House. And that brings up a kind of new reality that House Republicans are going to start to grapple with, which is there are not going to be the votes to override presidential vetoes, with Nancy Pelosi having a very liberal caucus, very compliant in most cases. So there may be some times when the White House makes a judgment that, as it did with the Cromnibus last year, that a particular easing of Dodd-Frank or change in Dodd-Frank might not be so objectionable that it would require it to veto another huge, enormous bill. But individual changes and standalone measures are going to be very, very hard to get past a presidential veto.
Let's go to the phones and listen to some of our callers. Talking first to Jackson, who's calling us from Georgia. Jackson, hi.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to comment on the relationship between France and the U.S. at the current moment. I remember back in 2011, after we were attacked, that, the French did not come running over here, and they were actually, nonchalant about it, and had the attitude that welcoming America to the real world, attacks happen everywhere. It seems to me that the current people in this country that are upset about the administration not going to France are the same people at that time that were pushing for freedom fries and were upset that the French didn't come over here. And I just wanted to get the panel's comment.
All right, Jackson, thanks very much for your call. Is that a fair characterization, do you think, of France's reaction to the 9/11 attacks?
I don't think it is. The French were very supportive of the U.S. After the 9/11 attacks. The French did not support the Iraq War. That's where the Freedom Fries dispute came from. And I think if you look at this issue, the White House themselves does not, at least from my understanding, does not admit a lot of mistakes openly. In this case, they were very emphatic on Monday in saying, we made a mistake. We should have had a more high-level official participate in that march. And I think, and that's a rare moment where the president's team was very emphatic. He's a news conference today. I assume he'll address this again. I think it was a moment where the U.S. probably should have had a bigger role in unifying with the rest of the world.
This was the scene, the march in Paris after the attack on the satiric magazine, where we saw the leader of Germany and the United Kingdom and France and Israel and of the Palestinian territories marching together. No high-ranking U.S. official, only the U.S. ambassador to France way in the back. Jeff, how did this happen?
Well, that's a good question. And the White House is trying not to give a whole lot of details about how it happened. Basically, they did not send the president, obviously, or Vice President Biden, or anyone particularly high level other than the U.S. ambassador to France. That led to a lot of questions at the White House briefing on Monday. And as Perry said, Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, said it was a mistake. But he did not want to say who made it. And we've been asking, lots of reporters have been asking, to what extent, where was this decision made? Did it go, how high up did it go? The White House has said it did not get up to the president's desk. But clearly it was the wrong call, and they regret it, and they've taken quite a bit of bad press for it. I do think it's important to note though, and the White House has noted this as well, France has not criticized the U.S. And the president did come out and speak very forcefully about this after the shootings, both in the Oval Office and on a trip to Tennessee. He went to the French embassy here in Washington and signed a condolence book. So the French have taken all of those actions as being sufficient and being quite supportive.
I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. Here's a story I didn't think we'd be covering this year. Mitt Romney running for president again. Perry, is he running?
He's really thinking about it. I mean, I'll admit, Susan, I'm with you. I had heard all the rumors for a while and kind of laughed them off. I thought there is no way. Republicans were very angry with Mitt Romney after the 2012 campaign. Felt like he didn't run well enough. He lost a winnable race. But Mitt Romney has given this real serious consideration. He's been calling people in Iowa and New Hampshire, calling his former donors, calling his former supporters. He's in San Diego today to give a speech at an RNC meeting. So he's not in fully, but what he's doing is trying to gauge support and figure out, is there room for me? Do people want me instead of Jeb Bush particularly? So he's definitely thinking about this. The Republicans I've talked to, even people who were for him last time, are trying to be politely nudge him the other way. They're saying Mitt Romney would be a great president, and then they start talking about he may not be the right candidate. Maybe Americans are tired of him. I think you're getting the Republican Party is trying to give him a polite, maybe not this time, but he's so far not listening.
Ruth, is there a space for him?
Actually, it's a really interesting question whether there's a space for him and also space for Chris Christie and some of the other folks. This definitely makes our life a lot more interesting, right? So I'm all for it. Everybody should jump into the pool. It's getting a little crowded there. I think history would not suggest that there's a lot of space for Mitt Romney. The last major party nominee who ran again and won was Richard Nixon in 1968. It just doesn't happen. The president famously talked about people wanting the new car smell. This definitely, and he does have a history with the car industry, is not a new car smell. I think that in the short term, it has a big impact on Chris Christie because you've got a limited pool of donors. Some of them have a history with Romney. Some of them have a history with Romney, but are moving to Bush. Where does that leave Christie in kind of sewing up this field? Let's just say the response to Romney has not been overwhelming. So perhaps having said, which is absolutely a true sentence, I want to be president, is what he said to his donors. There's no doubt about that. If he decides that he doesn't have a route, that may free things up. But in the meantime, it just kind of freezes the field for right now. And it's going to be really interesting to watch.
But he's ahead in the polls.
He's ahead in the polls. And he won the nomination last time. And Ruth, while you're exactly right, the only one with a kind of a perfect parallel, the last one with a kind of perfect parallel would be Nixon. But the fact is Ronald Reagan ran for president 3 times before he finally got it. How many times did Bill Clinton come back from political death? I mean, not, more times than you could count, even after he was in the White House. So I guess I'm inclined to say, we'll see whether he learned some lessons from last time around, we'll see if he does better this time than he did last time.
And he's going to study it, and he's going to see, how the donors react. I think it's been interesting watching the rollout at the beginning. Everyone was really sort of jazzed by the fact that here comes Romney again, and then you're seeing stories, as Perry referred to, of Republicans being less excited. So it'll depend largely on whether or not they see that space literally among support from voters and constituents.
And I think it poses a particular conundrum for Jeb Bush, because Jeb Bush had appeared to be the consensus might be too strong, but the establishment candidate, but with some issues in the Republican Party, especially in running in Republican primaries. He's much more supportive of immigration reform. He's supportive of education reform initiatives like the Common Core. If Romney is really in, he makes Jeb Bush look like the leftist candidate in that field. That is not a correct assessment of Jeb Bush's ideology, but that really affects Jeb Bush's ability to do what he said he wanted to do, which is run in a primary campaign that does not push him so far to the right that he disqualifies himself as a general election candidate.
And if you have these multiple candidates that are sort of in the establishment, Perry, like Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney and Chris Christie, does that help Republicans who come from other sides of the party, like a Rand Paul, for instance?
I don't think it does. I just think at the end of the day, the Republican Party tends to pick somebody who's sort of a traditional conservative. Mitt Romney, John McCain, George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole. I think the thing we've learned this week most is that Hillary Clinton is a very, very strong favorite on the Democratic side, and Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney are not as strong as her, and they're going to have to run a real race to win.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll go to the phones. We'll take some of your calls and questions, 1-800-433-8850. We'll read your emails. Stay with us.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Cancer Treatment Centers of America, where nutritional therapy is part of every patient's treatment plan to help boost their immune system and manage side effects while undergoing treatment. Learn more at cancercenter.com. From Constant Contact, providing small businesses and nonprofits email and online marketing tools to engage customers and connect with new ones, for sending newsletters, promoting events, and tracking results. More at constantcontact.com. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
On the next Diane Rehm Show, the international hour of the Friday News Roundup. A new issue of Charlie Hebdo sells out in Paris. Satellite images show the scale of Boko Haram's destruction in Nigeria. And President Obama eases Cuban travel and trade rules. The Diane Rehm Show, next hour. Welcome back. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. For the first hour of our Friday News Roundup, we're joined by Jeff Mason of Reuters, Ruth Marcus of The Washington Post, Perry Bacon of NBC News, and you can watch video of this hour on the website drshow.org. Let's go to the phones. Let some of our listeners have a word with us, join the conversation. We'll go first to Matt. He's calling us from Hanover, Pennsylvania. Hi, Matt. You're on the air.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for taking my call. I wanted to go back to the State of the Union address and President Obama giving interviews to YouTube personalities. Ruth Marcus insinuated that non-traditional sources of media are less capable of asking tough questions or follow-up questions than I guess traditionally trained journalists, traditionally employed journalists. I think that that's pretty audacious, given that the traditional media, her newspaper and herself in particular, failed utterly to ask tough questions or follow-up questions of the previous administration and the previous president during the run-up to the Iraq War. And of course, now we know that the things that were being presented then were cherry-picked at best and outright lies at worst. I think the Washington Post in particular was particularly guilty of wholeheartedly swallowing what the administration was selling and not asking those follow-up questions.
All right, Matt, thanks for your call. Let me give Ruth a chance to respond.
I don't want to relitigate the war. I don't think it's fair to talk about my own role in that, because there is nothing on the record that would suggest my position on that or my failure. And I guess I'm just going to double down and repeat what I said, which is it is intimidating to interview presidents and hard to stop them from filibustering. And I would argue that those of us who have experience doing it and live with the news every day are probably in a better position to do that respectful interrupting and, more important, ask follow-up questions than others. And that's not to say that presidents shouldn't talk to anybody but trained journalists, but it's to stick up for the importance of what we do.
And we'll see what happens. We'll all be watching Tuesday night, and we'll see whether it's the conversation is illuminating in some way, because sometimes it is with these more offbeat interviews, or whether it feels like kind of a missed opportunity to talk about the substance of some of the policies
Just one
that
note.
the president will be unveiling.
I like when the president talks to Jon Stewart. I like when he talks to Brian Williams. I don't think this is I think it's not a choice in either or. I think we should go for both. I mean, non-traditional interviews do yield occasionally when he's asked something from an unusual source. It's helpful, and I appreciate those things too. But the core, the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on deserve to have interviews with the president, of course.
It sort of reminds me of presidential debates, where often one presidential debate will be a town hall forum where regular folks
Exactly.
get to stand up and ask
Great
a question. It can be harder for a politician to filibuster when it's a real citizen. On the other hand, I also like the debates where there's a moderator, a skilled moderator, who can ask a follow-up question or offer some context or press a candidate. So we just want to hear more from the president. I guess that's the point. Let's go to Catherine. She's calling us from South Riding, Virginia. Catherine, you're on the Diane Rehm Show.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Ruth just made a comment about sticking up for journalists, and I wanted to ask everyone on the panel about, I think we all know what the position is of every nation on terrorism, and I saw the attack very clearly, and I think probably all of you did too, the attack in France as a specific attack on journalism, on media, on free speech. And if you look at the 40 country leaders who are marching and thinking, like right now, like Putin and El-Sisi and Erdogan, I mean, you're looking at people who suppress free speech, who persecute journalists. And so, quite frankly, if I had been the president's advisor, I would have advised him not to go. Because, again, to me, the focus was on these people and on free speech, and much less on, we're all united against terrorism. And I just wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Catherine, that's a good point, because we saw, for instance, leader Saudi Arabia there. Saudi Arabia now has been, been whipping a blogger for the comments that he posted on his blog. But Jeff, from your position at the White House, is that a reason? Do you think that was one of the reasons the White House chose not to go there?
It's not one of the reasons they've cited, so I think that's probably very unlikely. And the reasons they've cited have to do with security, have to do with the fact that it was planned within a 30-hour time period. I think this White House is very, and has come out in the wake of these attacks, is very supportive of the First Amendment rights in this country and the right to free speech around the world.
Catherine, thanks so much for your call. Ruth.
And I agree with what Jeff said, and I guess I would just like to add, this is a White House that has proven itself to be surprisingly fumbling when it comes to issues of symbolism. They disdain it as optics, but I'm thinking back to the episode this summer where the president went out and played golf and was shown playing golf after one of those horrific beheadings
of James Foley.
Also a journalist.
Yeah.
And it just needs to be, I think, a little more attentive to the importance of symbolism in addition to the importance of substance.
Let's talk to Patricia. She's calling us from Cleveland, Ohio. Patricia, thanks for holding on.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. I'm Patricia Stoddard-Dare, and I'm a social work professor and social policy analyst from Cleveland State University. And I'm working with Dr. Linda Quinn from CSU and also Dr. Leanne DeRenier from Florida Atlantic University. And we have some new research findings that are forthcoming in publication that we believe would inform the conversation regarding paid sick leave and the implications of not having paid sick leave benefits. Using a large data set collected by the Census
Patricia,
Bureau.
I'm sure you've got some great research here, but do you have a question for our panel that they could respond to?
I was going to share some data regarding the sick leave benefits.
Well,
and the implications
I think
in
that's a
terms of
great
delays of care.
That's a great topic, and I'm sure that Diane is going to want to do a show on this topic of paid sick leave, as she's done in the past, and on family leave as well. And so we'll certainly make sure she's aware of the research that you've done. Let's talk about this amazing arrest this week. An Ohio man charged with plans to attack the U.S. Capitol. Do we think, Perry, that lawmakers were in real danger of having an attack there?
It doesn't seem like that from what I've read just so far, and the way Boehner's office responded to it. It sounds more like a man who was crazy, had a plan in Cincinnati. I don't know. It's not clear to me that he got that close to executing it. That said, it is still scary to read about these kinds of incidents.
The thing that struck me about this story is that Speaker Boehner said that this guy was caught as a result of this kind of mass collection, this collection of metadata. Ruth, can you tell us what he says happened there?
Well, I'm not entirely sure about the metadata, but he was, as I understand it, found he made public Twitter comments in support of ISIS. And so one of the things that I find so scary about these episodes is we have to rely on the stupidity of would-be terrorists to some extent. If our system is so porous, and so there are so many potentially soft targets, even softer than the Capitol, which has become a lot more hard for even us to get into and penetrate without appropriate ID. But you see this issue of the self-radicalized people, both in Europe and here, and the ability to have weapons and the ability to wreak enormous amounts of damage very quickly. And we've been very lucky, and possibly very lucky plus skillful in catching them, whether through published social media sources or through metadata collection, in stopping, I think, a lot of these things. But if they get smarter or we get less lucky, there's a real risk that these folks pose.
This 20-year-old man from Cincinnati who was arrested had purchased a semi-automatic rifle and 600 rounds of ammunition and talked about his plans to travel to Washington. We had a weirder arrest in Cincinnati. I don't know what's going on in Cincinnati these days, but on a guy who worked at a country club serving John Boehner drinks, who talked about wanting to poison him.
Yeah, he was fired last October and called the police essentially and threatened John Boehner. Sent an email to Speaker Boehner's wife, said he regretted not taking the opportunity to poison him, and basically threatened the speaker, and he ended up being arrested. So very, very strange. And someone who had worked in this country club where Boehner and his wife are members for some 5 years. He was known as Bartender Mike.
Kind of a reminder of the dangers of this world. Well, let's go back to the phones. We'll talk to Felix. He's calling us from Northville, Michigan. Hi, Felix.
Hey, ma'am. I wanted to ask one question, and I kind of have a question. I mean, answers from my own question. I will take your different opinion about this. Well,
oh yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'll go with question first. Question is, what party will benefit from immigration reform overall? I've been in this country 15 years now. In my opinion, Republicans will benefit.
And
overall.
Felix, tell us where you're coming. Where did you come from?
Yes, country called Uzbekistan. I grew up in Soviet
Sure.
Union.
Yeah. Well, let me take your question and ask Perry. Perry, what party is likely to really benefit from this whole immigration reform debate?
At least from what I see right now, the Latino population is growing in the country, and the Republicans are irritating them with the positions they're taking. So at this moment right now, I would argue this is a hard question to answer, though, in part because the Republicans just won the House and the Senate, a few months ago. So it's not clear. So we've had a 6-year-long immigration debate, and the results of that have been the Democrats have won the presidential election when more Latinos vote, and the Republicans have won the congressional elections when there tends to be a whiter, less diverse electorate. So the answer is not entirely perfectly clear to me which party is benefiting.
But in the short term, it may be hard to answer. But in the long term, there's really no question, is there, that if you're a party who is seen as hostile to the fastest growing ethnic group in the American electorate, you are going to be a loser in that calculation.
And I think RNC Chairman Reince Priebus essentially announced the answer to that question in his post-mortem of the 2012 election, where he talked about his report talked about the need for the party to change. I think it will be very fascinating to watch during the upcoming primary season how Republican presidential candidates answer the question that Perry raised earlier. If you are president, will you repeal the deferred action for Dreamers?
And one of the calculations, Jeff, I think the president has made is that by putting this policy in place, I mean, he can't oblige his successor to continue it because it's by executive action, but you put it in place, it's in place for a couple of years, people start to rely on it. It is really difficult to repeal it.
Absolutely. And particularly when you're talking about real people with families, with kids, who are affected by this. If you want, as a Republican candidate, to come out and say, actually, I'm not in favor of this anymore and I want to turn this back, that's not going to go over well with a very, very important constituency group and a very important voting bloc in presidential elections. Perry's right that it's a slightly different calculus when we discuss congressional elections, but in the long term and looking at the White House, it's going to help Democrats.
One more interesting point of this question. The Republican presidential candidates, most of them are going to a forum hosted by Steve King in Iowa next Saturday. And it's going to be an interesting question. I think Steve King is one of the biggest opponents of both these deferred action programs. I assume he's going to ask Governor Christie, Governor Walker, Senator Cruz, Senator Rubio, what do you think about this action program? And in front of a crowd of Iowa conservatives, I'm going to be very curious to see how, like Chris Christie, who's generally more of a liberal Republican, how he answers a question in front of a crowd that is not going to want to hear, no, I think this program should stay in place. It's an interesting question coming up very soon.
And of course, as they all know, you can no longer give an answer to one group and have some other groups not notice it in today's media environment. We'll all see what they're going to say there. I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. We've been covering this controversy over the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA for years, I guess. And most recently, the controversy over whether the CIA, in effect, spied on the Senate Intelligence Committee in an inappropriate way. We got a report this week, Ruth, that basically said the CIA people who did this action shouldn't be held to account for it.
Yes, I don't quite know what to make of this. This was an episode that absolutely infuriated the then chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein, and you can understand why she would be upset about the CIA investigating her own staff. The CIA Inspector General had found that these Senate computers, they were shared computers, were improperly accessed. But this review that was headed by one of Senator Feinstein's former Democratic senator colleagues, Evan Bayh of Indiana, no longer a senator, found that the CIA personnel acted reasonably. So up in the air who you want to credit here.
Jeff, this conclusion seemed at odds with what the CIA Inspector General concluded, which that there was, in effect, wrongdoing, and that for which the Senate Intelligence Committee deserved an apology.
Yeah, it was at odds. I mean, the Inspector General found that they had acted inappropriately, and this panel is saying that that's not the case, that there was some confusion about what they were looking at, and that they actually had acted in good faith.
Yeah.
So,
Perry, do you think Americans care about this, or is it just one of those Washington things?
I don't think Americans are analyzing this. I do think this is a Washington thing that's important, I would say, because there's two issues here. There's one about torture, and there's one about did the U.S. commit torture? How did it conduct that? How are we overseeing that? President Obama says we ban torture now. What does the next president do? The second question is about oversight. It seems to me, whatever you think about this investigation, the Senate. The leaders of the Senate do not feel as if the CIA allowed them to investigate the CIA's conduct, and Congress views its role as to have oversight and look at what the executive branch is doing. If the Senate feels like it cannot investigate the CIA without the CIA in effect spying on them, that's a big problem.
Ruth, we're going to give you the last word on this.
And lingering bad feelings between your CIA director and the now ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, probably not the best tactic on the part of the administration.
Ruth Marcus, she's a columnist with the Washington Post. And for this hour of the News Roundup, we've also been joined by Perry Bacon, senior political reporter at NBC News, and by Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. We've been glad to have your calls and questions and your emails during this hour. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. Thanks for listening.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Danielle Knight, Allison Brody, and Alexandra Botti. The engineer is Toby Schreiner. Natalie Urevlifker answers the phones. Visit drshow.org for audio archives, transcripts, and podcasts. Call 202-885-1200 for more information. Our email address is drshow@wamu.org, and we're on Facebook and Twitter. This program comes to you from American University in Washington, D.C. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, working to improve the quality of people's lives by supporting the performing arts, the environment, medical research, and child well-being. Information is available at ddcf.org. From the Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide at fordfoundation.org. And from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping NPR advance journalistic excellence in the digital age.
On the next Diane Rehm Show, Mario Cuomo spent 3 terms as New York governor and was a strong liberal voice throughout his career. He passed away January 1st at the age of 82. We listen back to Diane's 1995 conversation with Mario Cuomo.